Kathleen, I am ready whenever you are.
Well, I am definitely ready. It has been a while, everyone. We took the month of August off from our lunch and learns, and we are delighted to be gearing up again for a fabulous fall schedule. We're going to kick off our return today with a lunch and learn on simulating climate change scenarios and designing solutions. We've got ambitious goals set by the Climate Council, and Maine has positioned itself as a leader on national climate policy. How can we best encourage other states and countries to match our ambition? Well, En-ROADS can help, this incredible tool that we have to explore today. We've got Dr. Karl Kreutz, who's the University of Maine Climate Change Institute professor, and Peter Dugas, who is an En-ROADS climate ambassador and a part of the Citizens Climate Lobby. They're with us today to share an introduction to MIT's En-ROADS Climate Simulator and help us explore how it informs the search for effective and equitable climate policy on a local, national, and international level. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy. And MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers and save questions for a Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of them and ask those during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical challenges, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learn programs. Thanks again for joining us. And Peter, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and to everybody at Maine Conservation Voters. It's been quite an honor to be able to prepare this and to bring this fascinating and very up-to-date and surprisingly easy to use climate simulator for you all. I've already put in the chat the link to the climate simulator that you could open up, and I will do that again at the end of the session as a reminder for those in case people come on late. But I will begin to share my screen with you for a second, and we can walk through it together, and you can take a little look at my screen as I play with it and give you a very quick introduction to the climate simulator, what it does, and first a little bit about its history. MIT created, MIT's Sloan School of Management has a nonprofit arm dedicated towards climate education called Climate Interactive, and they've developed a number of tools. Most successfully is a previous incarnation was called C-ROADS, which was developed about 8 years ago, which was a much more limited in scope model, which basically was, we've heard from a number of different sources, that was actually used pivotally at the negotiations for the Paris Protocol negotiations in 2015. C-ROADS was basically taking different regions of the planet, talking about where they had to limit their carbon output in order for us to avoid catastrophe, and in order for us to meet the goals set by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. En-ROADS was just released, well, it's almost 2 years, it's about a year and a half old now. And it's much more policy and economics based in that you can really get into the nitty gritty of different policies and see what kind of interaction they have, and to see what we could, how much they would limit our potential temperature increases and other effects from climate change. So I will go ahead and start with the introduction, and then we'll open it up for questions. But let me give you a tour of it first by sharing my screen. And just give me a thumbs up, Dr. Karl, when you see this. Okay, great, everyone's seeing this. Let me give you a quick tour of what we're looking at here. So if you go to this website, this is by the way, free and easy to use, so you don't have to pay anybody to use this. But what we're looking at here is where globally energy has been coming from for the past 20, 21 years now, and where we're projected to see this go for the next 80 years. So a little bit of history and a lot of prognostication. And you can see the different lines here are coal is the brown line or dark line, oil is red, natural gas is blue, renewable energy is green, bioenergy is pinkish, nuclear hugging the bottom here, and then a category for something unforeseen that may come in the future, perhaps nuclear fusion. We're hearing a lot of news about that recently, or perhaps we'll discover vibranium or the flux capacitor or something else out of a sci-fi idea. So that's kind of hugs the bottom. And each of these toggles kind of control the supply of our energy. So we can grab each of these toggles and move them left or right to either, and this is not to wave a magic wand to make coal go away, but it's basically incentivizing us as an economics performance. So I can either tax coal or, God forbid, give tax subsidies for coal. And you can see that each one of these has got a macro level adjustment, which is this black knob I could move left or right. Or for each one of these, I can actually click on these 3 dots, and you can see that you're getting a more nuanced approach where I can be a little bit more detailed about what I'm doing, and I can take a look at perhaps reading up about what their presumptions are. So that's the energy supply side. And then the rest of this is really demand over here, which is for transportation, energy efficiency, we can adjust that, or the electrification of our transportation. We could also look at building as an industry, same thing, energy and efficiency and electrification. Growth, either population growth, or as much as we can control that, and economic growth. And then over here, we have land management. So the rate at which we're cutting down the world's trees, deforestation, and then methane and other gases. Carbon dioxide is our primary concern. It's about 80% or more of the world's climate change greenhouse gas. I should say, rephrase that. Carbon dioxide is responsible for about 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And then here, carbon removal, which it looks like we're going to have to engage with, which is either planting trees, afforestation, or technological, which I will click on these just because technological can mean anything from bioenergy capture, carbon capture and storage, which is basically kind of bioengineering algae and other things that might be able to suck up carbon at a greater rate than they might naturally. Direct air capture, which is like HVAC equipment that would suck carbon out of the atmosphere as they're working in Switzerland and other European countries. Not cost effective yet, but perhaps in the future. Enhanced mineralization, agricultural soil sequestration, and biochar are the other 3, which are all kinds of different means of sequestering it in our soil. So it means like soil management. So, and then over here is the big money graph, which shows where in degrees Celsius, where our temperature increases above pre-industrial levels have been. 2000, we were at 0.83% above pre-industrial levels. This year, what are we at? We're like 1.3, and we're projected, this is business as usual, if we don't do anything, we'll be at 3.6 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And of course, that's a global average. By the poles, it'll be a lot more, and there will be other places that might not have as much. But and then these dashed lines are our challenge to stay below. The IPCC recommended staying below 1.5 degrees, which in this trajectory, this is where you get that 10-year gap. They're saying like we'll probably go past that in a decade unless we do something drastic. And then 2 degrees, which is perhaps we can sacrifice some of the dreaded consequences of climate change, but we may avert catastrophe or existential threats if we keep below 2 degrees. So that's it in a nutshell. I should be very honest before we start playing with this, just to say that I'm barely giving you the slice of this. This is a very sophisticated model and very fun to play with, although sobering. But I just clicked on this graph to show all the different things we can look at and model through these manipulations. So we're looking at temperature increases here, but I could look at sea level rise, greenhouse gas emission by gas, and cost of electricity, a lot of different things. I could also dive into, sometimes you may be interested where they're getting their data. A lot of this is coming from multiplying these factors together will give us the carbon output, which is global population, GDP per capita, energy intensity of that GDP. Funny enough, you can see two little blips, one from the 2008 economic downturn, which made it less, suddenly people were, large parts of the world were going back to dirtier fuels. And the same thing again during the COVID problems we've been having in the past couple of years. And then carbon intensity of that final energy, and then multiply it all together, your units will work out to CO2 emissions from that energy. But so that's that in a nutshell. And what I'd like to do is then open it up and see if you guys had ideas. We could put it into the chat, and Luke can read to me opinions about things they would like to have to see modeled or on this graph. I'd say two things up front. One, or I keep saying that quickly. Remember that this is a global model. So it's very important to keep that in the back of your mind as we move through this, because what may be great in Maine and other places may not be great in other parts of the world. In other words, not every place is as blessed with Maine with a relatively green electrical grid, for instance, or a lot of forest content. But we'll move forward with that assumption and also be and see what the simulator tells us. So Luke, do you see any suggestions in there? Luke, are you with us? Huh, okay.
Peter, I have one, and I know you have a couple to start, but
okay.
One on land use for agriculture, methane emissions, and somebody wants to see a whole bunch of electric vehicles.
Okay, let me start with the last one first. A whole bunch of electric vehicles, as we all know, is Maine is doing wonderful things, in no small part because the advocacy of groups like Maine Conservation Voters and other groups. But Governor Mills has been talking about electrical vehicles a lot, and for good reason, because that's where that's the biggest factor in Maine's greenhouse gas emissions. If I were to look at electrification of our vehicles and just grab this toggle and move it, you might imagine what's going to happen over here with where our energy is coming from, which lines are going to go up and which are going to go down, and also what that might mean for global temperature increases, expected temperature increases. So that's, so think about what that might mean. We're gonna see a divergence in these two lines between the baseline and which is business as usual, and the current scenario. So as I imagine what you might see, and I'll move this over, remember this is global. So as I move this all over, we should all like seeing that red line go down, which means oil, which is gonna eventually become petrol or gas, and our tank goes down, and we see renewables going up. Excellent. However, we did see, and we saw a modest gain. This is nothing to balk at in terms of where we're expecting our temperature increases. But one of the things I might highlight, let me go back and forth. There's these nice arrows I can show you. This is business as usual all the way through the century. This is tons of incentives for electrical vehicles, maxing out what the model thinks is possible. And one of the reasons why you may not see the temperature differences as you might have expected is take a look at what's going on with the brown line, the coal line. Can you see how even though we see gas going way down or oil going way down, the coal line goes up a little bit? And you have to ask yourself, well, if we're switching to electric vehicles and that's the only policy we're doing here, where a lot of the world is still getting their electricity, particularly in the developing world, from coal predominantly. So we're then asking for more demand from coal. Coal line goes up, and which is the dirtiest and most plentiful and therefore cheapest fossil fuel. So that's a bad thing. So there you have to think globally, and in this very intricate system, there's over 1,600 complementary equations going into this. So that is electrification. Luke, remind me, what was the next one? I think it was, we talked about planting, was it plants or agricultural soil sequestration?
Well, Peter, I wonder if before we switch that, what if we keep the electric vehicles turned all the way up and an increased number of renewables? Would that?
Sure, that's a great idea. Yeah, so now we're doing combinations of things. I like to go back to zero just because it's really helpful to see what it does at one point at a time. But that's a great suggestion, Kathleen. Let me move that. So let's move this all the way over at the same time. And we can see that does very nicely, brings all of that. We've now highly subsidized or highly incentivized renewables. And so we maxed out the subsidies for renewables and we've maxed out the electrification for our vehicles. So I do like seeing that. However, you can see that there's this steady growth among, or not growth, yeah, I guess it's very slow growth amongst coal and even amongst natural gas. But the petrol will go down. So it's still, even with that switch to renewables, that'll happen. One of the instructive things I think about this, getting into your point, Kathleen, is what happens when we just maximize the subsidies for renewables. You can see what happens with coal is that it will go down in the short term, especially like mid-century. You can see that coal line stagnates and flattens and goes down a bit. But what happens is at mid-century, as the market has kind of absorbed these new highly subsidized mechanisms for getting renewables all over the place, the market kind of absorbs that, and we can see that coal will then start to increase again. Because what happened, you can think about, it's basically Econ 101, an economic rebound effect. We've given tons of money to, in some way for folks to put renewables everywhere. So what's going to happen? People are going to stop buying coal. The price of coal will then start going down worldwide. But what happens once the price of coal starts going down worldwide? People are going to start being attracted to it again. So it starts picking up again. And that's exactly what we're seeing there. I might move over to the planting 1 trillion trees, if that's okay, Luke, which was, I think, another thing was mentioned. We've heard a lot about that. We can move this toggle all the way over. We're seeing that it does nothing in terms of where our energy is coming from. And it does absorb a bit, but it's being overwhelmed by this. I might actually show another graph here, which shows greenhouse gas. This is one of my favorites, which is a little bit wonkier, but greenhouse gas emissions by gas area. So without anything, this is business as usual. You can see that charcoal gray. Energy CO2 just keeps on increasing towards as the century goes on. By planting 1 trillion trees, we're not doing anything for the upper part of the graph, but you can look at the bottom of that graph to see we can start talking about sequestration. And you see a little bit of a chunk there where we're starting to suck into our forests. However, it's not nearly keeping up. It's being overwhelmed by all that carbon being released into the air through energy uses.
Peter, this is Will here, and Kathleen has a few scenarios that people have come in with. So I think Kathleen can verbalize for you.
Please, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, thank you. Folks are wondering what would happen if we eliminated all fossil fuels.
Okay, right. Okay, so the easiest way to do that is to talk about like an international pact, and we stop building new coal infrastructure. Let's start with there, because that's the dirtiest, nastiest fossil fuel and most plentiful. So if I did that, that is the second biggest single policy that I have found, which is basically took a big chunk out of it. It did the same thing, if you remember, if I believe, I'm remembering this correctly, from sliding electrification of transportation and renewables way over to the right. So I maximize both of those as the same as making a worldwide pact to stop coal plant production. Very tricky to do, but is on the table. We could do the same thing perhaps with oil and just basically kind of tax it quite a bit, which I'm just going to do with a macro level. Very highly taxed, try to bring that down. And natural gas, the same. Other ideas, Kathleen?
Well, a quick question first on that, on the renewables category.
Yes.
are all renewables treated the same? Are they all sort of rolled in together, whether it's solar or wind or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, for the ease of use of this model, it's yes. They're mostly rolled into one category. And you can read up about this more about how they've designed this, or go into the actual the Climate Interactive website to see why they're doing this. From the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions and temperature increases, what we're ultimately worried about, this is the reason that they're all the same. I mean, obviously they're very different in construction and leasing, and the NIMBYism that might be going into offshore wind or onshore wind or solar farms or whatever that might be. But they're all rolled into one. Basically, the easy answer for why is for the ease of use of the model, to make it. It's the same reason why we can't geographically isolate regions, just so that the model is interactive and easy to make composites.
That makes a lot of sense. This is pretty complicated as it is.
Yes, right.
I appreciate the streamlining.
Yeah.
What if we went back to zero and tried really increasing energy efficiency in buildings?
Excellent. Great. Okay, so energy efficiency in buildings. Move this all the way over. Wonderful. We like seeing that.
And what about electrification of buildings as well?
Sure. Yeah, and industry. There you go. We've maxed out energy efficiency and the electrification of buildings and industry.
Seems like a solid choice.
Yep. Excellent. Yeah.
There's also some interest in looking at what would happen if population growth declines, maybe without the other changes, because I appreciate that suggestion to look at one factor at a time at first.
Yes, it's and it's just because it gives you, what the model lacks in terms of like answering specific questions for what we do here in Maine. It does still work on comparative policy measures. So for instance, population, if we just said, okay, we're just going to assume that population is going to level off and start declining mid-century. This is, again, maxing out what the UN data says is possible. So this is business as usual, but with smaller population, or a flattening out and then a decreasing population. So at this point, I don't know if I've been doing these demonstrations for quite a long time, and I know I should turn this over to Dr. Karl and talk about his work and using this with his students. For me, first time I saw this, I know that I had to be. It was very sobering. This is not. It's very cool to see this all work and to slide things around and imagine what this might do. And I push against maybe the conservatism of some of their assumptions about how much some of these things might do. But before I pass it on to Dr. Karl, I do want to get it at some point to a place that's around these dashed lines, which I'd be happy to show. But let me ask first, Kathleen or Will, are there more suggestions?
Can we see what would happen if we put a price on carbon?
I love it. Okay, so yes, there are a number of different, this is a worldwide price on carbon. I'm going to put in there are currently 6 different bills in Congress, I believe 2 in the House, 4 in the Senate, and it's on the table as far as the budget reconciliation negotiations that our Senator King is in the middle of. But the one that has the most co-sponsors, including 1st District Representative Shelley Pingree, is an original co-sponsor of something called the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, which starts out at $15 per ton CO2 applied on the polluters. So that's coal mine, fracking site, oil derrick, or port of entry. And it's been forecasted that could be applied. We could apply that within the first 9 months, and every year it goes up by $10 a year, which means $10 per year for the next 80 years plus 15, so that by 2018, we're going to this, shows us what a carbon price would do, which, as I said, when we got rid of coal in one international worldwide ban on building new coal plants, that was the second largest effect. This is the first. This is the biggest, is putting a price on carbon. So, in full disclosure, I'm also the Portland chapter co-chair of Citizens Climate Lobby, which is working on national policy focused on a number of things, but particularly carbon pricing. And Maine can do more than any other state because we're the only state with both of our senators in the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. And we know that they're talking about this. But if we looked at this, and then we talked about, you can see that, oops, I'm sorry, wrong graph. We did greenhouse gas emissions by area. Without that policy, that coal keeps, that carbon from emissions and keeps on climbing. With the policy, you can see that by the end of the century, it's no longer the prime driver. It's now methane is now the bigger driver of climate change. So we could add to that regulating methane, which is a much smaller market, and then we're almost at that magic 2 degrees. And this is before talking about the other things that are very likely to move, like energy efficiency, electrification of vehicles, and of course technological, soil sequestration.
You must have been reading my mind because there were quite a few questions about methane.
Yes.
From both what happens if we eliminate fracking, all the way to what happens if we eliminate beef cattle. And
right.
Is there a way to drill down into the differences there, or can we just reduce methane? How flexible is the model on that?
It's actually, yeah, that's one where it is flexible, thankfully. Let me just back up so you can see what I did. Remember, for the more nuanced questions or details, I go to these 3 dots and I can click on that. Whoops, one thinks I can click on that. There you go. And I can click on this and see use detailed settings. So I can talk about, well, should I, agricultural waste, this is with the carbon price, and this is through energy and industry emissions, which is predominantly leaky lines for natural gas. So if we knock that down, there's more nuanced things in there. But yes, you can break that down to agriculture is here and energy emissions is there.
And I forgot, Peter. Oh, that's just the methane is getting us to that 2 degrees, right?
No, I'm sorry. This is with the carbon price. The carbon price looks small. So let me go back to that beginning. Okay. So without anything, I'll go back to this. Sorry, I was adding that to the carbon price. The carbon price is, as the IPCC new report says, is they call it as I have the past few reports, a necessary condition for successful climate strategy. So, but here's with methane emissions reduced alone, you can see that blue section gets smaller, 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 poof.
Great, and we have some additional questions about carbon pricing and what happens with the proceeds there.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that now, or do you want to keep playing with scenarios and save that?
I think it's fine to move on. I'm happy to bring this back up we have plenty of time we have a decent amount of time for Q&A. So yeah, the big question is, what do you do with those proceeds, right? If it's just a carbon tax, I think the questioner is probably thinking the first thing, the thing I thought of, my first reaction to that, which is carbon tax. Well, that's, it sounds great to tax the polluters. So we're taxing the Exxon Mobils of the world and the Chevrons and all and the like, the Saudi Aramcos. But they're just going to carry that fee down to the middleman and down until eventually gets to us. So the economic calculation is that $15 initial price on carbon that we were talking about when I put that price into the model is about going to trick, when it comes down to us, about 12 cents on a gallon of gas if it was just pushed onto us, which we're used to those fluctuations, but every year it goes up by 10 bucks or what, 8-9 cents a gas. And eventually that's, going to squeeze people who are living paycheck to paycheck. That's exactly right. So there's a number of different mechanisms for what to do with this. And I'll slide over to my slideshow here. the proper one to look at is this. If you took that, if we tried to make this revenue neutral, meaning money in is money out, we're redistributing it to people in a number of different ways. There's capital recycling, which is economists speak for basically returning it as terms of capital gains tax. And you can see that's relatively regressive. It's hurting the bottom tier folks more, and the richest 20%, it's in quintile. So the richest 20% is actually making a little bit of money. Or your income tax recycling, which is basically rebates or cuts on your income tax, which is relatively flat. But if you actually give it back as a lump sum, and there's a number of countries that do this, namely Canada, this is their system that they've had, at least British Columbia's had it since 2008, and it's been very politically successful, is a lump sum. They have quarterly, but the bill that we're talking about is a monthly dividend check. The thinking being you get a dividend check every month because that's what your bills are mostly monthly. That actually is the most progressive way. So it's helping the bottom 20% the most, and everybody under the 60 percentile or thereabouts is doing relatively well. And then the top earners on the top, this is 60 to 80% earners, and then 80% on up, they're still less than 2%. But of course, these are the folks that have the most means of changing their lifestyle so that they're being more sustainable. And that's, that graph could be seen in a different way by deciles this way. This is a Department of Treasury study on this when they were first talking about it, but you can see how it helps everybody. Everyone comes out, roughly a net winner till someplace in the 60, 70 percentile, and then the top 30% of the ones who will lose a bit, but it's, again, less than 2%. And then in the state of Maine, you can see they've actually broken down these studies enough to see how that dividend check returned to every man, woman, and child in the country actually predominantly helps out the poorer inland parts of the state more than the wealthier coastal towns, which just aligns with what we're talking about. The thinking is this: here's the way this works is we're applying this economy-wide, which is why a carbon fee does so much more. When you think about carbon pricing, if you're like me and my first time hearing about this, or first 7 times hearing about this, I thought of gas for my car, number 2 heating oil for my house, and whatever goes into my electrical grid, which is in our case, some natural gas. That, if you put all those together, which are called direct carbon fees or direct carbon footprint, that amounts to what William Nordhaus, the economist, has broken down to about 27% of our carbon footprint, meaning the other 73% is embedded carbon, which is carbon to get the cup of coffee into my hand in the morning, or to build the hospital that I go to when I have a heart attack because of too much coffee, or to upload my phone's pictures into the cloud. Like, all that stuff has a carbon content that we don't think about. And it turns out that that's 73%, which is all that consumption actually has a carbon cost to it. And all that carbon cost is what makes it so that the richest people, just by having a more extravagant lifestyle, bring more to that carbon dividend fund, which means there's more money for us poor folks to reap the benefit from. Does that answer the question?
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Now, we've got some other ideas about specific scenarios, and I think I might ask one more and then ask you the real question, which is, what's the magic solution? But first, will you show us what happens if we increase bioenergy? And I'd love to see the specific options under there. Can we,
sure.
Can we look at
yes. Great. So here's what we're talking about with bioenergy. And there's a number of different things. When I do the more nuanced look at this, Kathleen and friends, this is basically subsidizing or taxing, obviously we wouldn't want to, well, there are some controversy with bioenergy, but it's also, there's a research and development breakthrough of cost reduction. So we can go through all that stuff. All this stuff is kind of like, if I grabbed this, is basically moving all of those toggles in the same direction at once. So I can slide that all the way over and see what happens when I move that in a direction. It doesn't look great, and I'm not sure why, because this question, oh, I see. It's because I'm just moving with the tax subsidies. So let's say, let's say there's a huge breakthrough in 10 years, or let's say even earlier. So I guess I'm not sure exactly. Wow, look at how squiggly that crazy line is. You can see the pink line moving all over the place. This is actually a question that I've never dealt with before to this degree of detail with this. So I will back up and say I am not sure exactly why we're seeing no projected change in this, but I'm happy if the caller, the writer wants me to look it up, I'm happy to send that question up the chain to the folks at Climate Interactive. My guess is because they're thinking probably bioenergy is thought of as being predominantly carbon neutral, right? And because we are still burning woodlots or whatever, or chips or something, and it's taking up more of the market, but what is it eating away from? Is it eating away from the projected change? Are the from renewables or from coal? So that's kind of where a lot of that comes from. You have to think about this as like a complex system where it's what market share is it most eating out of? If it's eating out of coal, that's a good thing. If it's eating out of renewables, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, and I feel like we're starting to get to this aha moment that there may not be one of these toggles that we can move and solve our problems, right?
Right.
So have you hit on the right combination of energy sources and changes to our economy that will get us to that 1.5 degree target? Or
yeah,
what do you start to see when you play with more than one of these at a time?
Yeah. So as I said before, I mean, let's see. Let me go back to the beginning. This is I would encourage to not to take my word for it, but to play around with the model as I put it in. You'll see it in your email follow up for this, and also in the chat. But really, my thinking has been, after playing with this a bunch, has been to basically prioritize in succession what has the biggest bang for the buck. So that revenue neutral carbon pricing is, as the IPCC, as I mentioned, they're saying it's a necessary condition. So I put that in. And of course, the US is one of only 2 countries that doesn't have a domestic carbon price. The other one being Australia, and they're much further along in developing theirs. So I start with the carbon price, and then I look at seeing where those other, where the remainder of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. And so when I see methane, then I say, okay, well, these methane is smaller portion of the economy, much smaller. So I can, it's much more likely that that'll work with regulations and diminishing that down. And, and I can start moving around with energy efficiency, which is going to lower a lot of this. But really what I tend to think of then is talking about doing something with agriculture, with either soil sequestration or bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which is, the algae and stuff. So I think about a modest bit of technological stuff. Technological carbon removal. And then we talk about we can play with all these things. Usually my goal has been 2 degrees because that's challenging enough, but you can see how there's a diminishing return once we start stacking these together. But if I do all these things together here and then say, okay, well, how am I gonna, it's really these combinations plus, I think we're beyond the point of return where we need to talk about carbon sequestration. But carbon sequestration, as you saw, can't do anything much on its own without putting a real kibosh on the amount of carbon we keep on pumping into the atmosphere. Does that make sense? So yeah, I'm getting down to 1.5. Look how easy it is. I'm just sliding these things over.
There you go. Peter, you shared some of the logistics of how the model works at the beginning, but I find that as we play with it, then those questions come up again. I'm like, what was that? So a couple questions about how the model works. When we get rid of fossil fuels, does En-ROADS automatically distribute our energy use to other sources? Or when we decrease one energy source, but the others are still at status quo, does that mean we're using more energy in the model, or how does that work?
I think they're saying that the energy demand is going to grow with population and economic growth, as I showed from these Kaya graphs here. So that's a great question. As these graphs show that what's happening as we move on. So global population we haven't adjusted, and GDP changes haven't adjusted. But energy intensity of that GDP has definitely changed. And then the carbon intensity of that energy is drastically changed. So the short answer to your question is when we go through this model, if we were to when we struck a knife into future coal use, for instance, it takes the demand that would have gone to coal to the other sources and distributes it out amongst basically using economic levers about which is cheapest, which way does it go, which is one of the reasons why when we first show that first look at electric vehicles, and don't get me wrong, we all should be switching to electric vehicles if we can, especially in Maine where we have a green grid. It'll help us all get to Governor Mills's targets. But if we're talking about doing that in Maine, it's one thing. Doing it in West Virginia or India or China is a very different thing because of where they're coming from. They're saying, okay, we're no longer talking about petrol demand. We're shifting that demand to whatever's cheapest in that region, which in a lot of the world means coal, because it's so plentiful.
Yeah, and that gets to another sort of, what did you say at the top of the hour question? Is this modeling uniform changes across the world, or is this modeling changes to US policy?
It's worldwide. So
okay.
That's why it's, and that's the other thing that makes us bullish about carbon pricing is because, like I said, there's 43 developed nations in the world. The US and Australia are the two that don't price carbon. So yes, it's a worldwide model, and I'll just show. So you have to really put your blinders on. So they're talking about averaging out over the world, but you can see here's the map of the world of all the countries that are either participating in a regional or domestic carbon price, and you can see the United States shares the distinction of not pricing carbon with other real winners like, well, I won't badmouth any countries, but like Libya, and Russia and others. So. Oh, sorry, I'll leave that up there. Sorry. I didn't mean to confuse and add more questions. Sorry, Kathleen.
No, this is a really, it's just fascinating, and it's really fun to play with this. I encourage everybody, when you get the email this afternoon, to just get right on the NREL site, and what a neat opportunity to be able to play with all of these things. Remind us, Peter, how this program was developed and who's using it.
Yeah, that's great. The training for this is free, and they're looking for more climate interactive volunteers, En-ROADS ambassadors, very fancy. That's what I'm called. And it basically means that I went to an 8-week program that was basically, and had to take a very easy, like an open book test at the end, but it's basically going through the accreditation that the Sloan School put together for being able to use this. It's very fun. It's very eye-opening, can be very sobering, as you might imagine from what we've looked at already this afternoon, but it's also empowering just to say like, okay, now I know where to focus. And so it's helpful. And the big takeaways, as I was saying, is that there is no silver bullet. As they say in the training, there's only silver buckshot. We need a lot of all of the above. But there are some things that will do more with the one fell swoop than others, and that's where the carbon pricing comes in, along with methane reductions and soil sequestration and that sort of thing. So, yeah, the training, and if you're curious about the training, you can just click on the Climate Interactive logo right there. And I think you can either watch recordings of it or join the live trainings where you can ask questions in time, and they're fascinating. It's really a intellectually amazing result of system dynamics, complex systems all working together, the economic system and energy system, and of course the atmosphere.
Well, and that's another piece, I think, as more and more folks get the opportunity to play with models like this, to learn and explore all of the different variables. Is there a slider for general climate education or climate literacy or political will? How is there? I mean, it's actually a very interesting question, right? How can we model the sort of societal changes and educational changes? Do you know of a model that does that, or?
No, I mean, well, because this is very numbers driven, as you can see, and it's very data specific, all that stuff is extremely important work. I can't praise Maine conservation voters enough for the outreach that they're doing. But without action, it doesn't really get us there, right? And we also know not only is it not enough to do, like, I remember the days 15 years ago carrying around an infrared camera into other people's basements, and I was going to save the world one basement at a time of insulation, which is all important stuff to do. Don't get me wrong. And it's getting Maine to where it needs to be. But not only is it not enough, it's also, we know, and Michael Mann's book would be recommended on this front. I had the honor of co-writing a piece from the Maine Sunday Telegram with Michael Mann that was published a couple of weeks ago. Michael Mann's new book was talking about not only is it enough to not take care of our own carbon footprint, but it's actually a deliberate strategy by the fossil fuel companies and their allies to distract us, to divide us, and to give us doom and distract us from what really needs to be done, which is public policy. And like I said earlier, in my barrage of words, we can do more, even though Maine contributes 0.3% of US carbon emissions, right? We're doing beautiful stuff in Maine, but we have to take care of the other 99.7% in the country. Even though that's very sobering, we can do more than any other state because we're the only state of all 50 that have two senators on the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. And whatever your political opinions or your political leanings, they have their ears open in a small state like Maine to public pressure. I know personally that Senator King is moving more and more in this direction, and Senator Collins was actually a champion of carbon dividends 12 years ago, and could be moved in that direction again with the right pressure.
It's really fascinating. And one of the other questions was, who's using this model? And I think Dr. Kreutz has something to tell us about that.
Sure. Kathleen, I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but I'll share my screen and just say a couple words about it if I can. Let's see. So can everybody see the model again? Yeah. Okay. Great. So thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. I learned I learned quite a bit about the model and the different knobs and things that go into this just by listening to you again. So that's great. But yeah, I mean, the model, it does have a lot of different uses, and one of those certainly is in education. I mean, as we're doing here, but I also use it at the university in a couple different classes. One of them that I teach is a 100 level class on energy in the Earth system. And, essentially we go through the same type of things that Peter was just doing, thinking about different scenarios and, just exploring with this model to see what those scenarios will do. But at more advanced level classes, we really start to ask the question, how does the model work? And in particular, again, it's easy to move the sliders around and watch the curves go up and down. But at some point you want to start to ask the question, well, what are the assumptions that's going into a model like this? And so one of the nice things about this En-ROADS model is you can go in and look at those assumptions. So if you go up to simulation and go down to assumptions, it's going to give you, a whole host of different things that sort of go into the backside of how this model works. And I've certainly not gone through all of these different assumptions, but the ones I have looked at relate to the stuff that I do in my research program, which is Earth science and Earth systems thinking. And particularly if you go into here to the climate system sensitivities, again, it goes on and on, but one of the ones I like to go through with the students that's really important in any of this is this term called climate sensitivity. And in the climate community, climate sensitivity is essentially a measure of how much global temperature will respond to the change in atmospheric carbon dioxide that we're talking about. And it turns out that this number, this relationship, has what that number actually is in the Earth system has a huge impact on what kind of temperature change we're going to see in the future. So folks can go in and look at this and read about it, but the model as it stands right now is set with a climate sensitivity of 3 degrees Celsius. So in other words, that means as we double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the global temperature response will be about 3 degrees Celsius. And it's valid to ask the question, well, how well do we know that term? Because if you take this slider and start to play around with it, you can see that if our estimate of climate sensitivity is off, in other words, if it's more like 5 degrees, then that makes a huge difference in the temperature change we're going to see out towards the end of the century. On the other side of the coin, if the climate sensitivity is quite a bit lower than the model is set, let's say it's down around 2 degrees Celsius, that also has a big impact in, let's say, a positive, like a good direction, so to speak. So folks can go in and look at these assumptions that the model is using, and I could say, you know, we could go through a lot of these different parameters there, but at least with respect to climate sensitivity, certainly the model is using the best available science that we have on this topic. And this is a topic of research that I and many other folks here at the university are involved with, particularly looking at Earth's history and asking the question, how has the Earth's temperature responded to changes in carbon dioxide levels in the past? I mean, we can go way back in time, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and look at that relationship, and that's what we do. And we can say with a fair degree of certainty that our best estimate is around 3 degrees Celsius, but there's bound to be some error in that estimate. So we can play with the slider and the model will act accordingly and give us some bounds on what the error there might be. You can go through and look at the other ones that are in here. You know, with this nice thing about this model, you can really start to ask the question, not only is how is the temperature going to change, but what are some other impacts that are going to result from our choices about energy usage? And of course, one that we're all interested in here in Maine, particularly in coastal Maine, if I can pull it up, is sea level rise. And so you can, in the model, look at the assumptions that go into this calculation of sea level rise. And there are a lot of assumptions that go into this. And again, very active area of research right now, trying to understand how the Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheets, as well as mountain glaciers around the world, are going to respond to the temperature change that results from our energy choices. There's a lot of uncertainty in this. I won't sugarcoat it. There's a lot of what we call feedbacks in the climate system, whereby big parts of Antarctica, the Antarctic ice sheet may respond quite quickly to a certain amount of temperature change. So you can play with this slider and see what kind of change these assumptions have on, let's say, sea level rise. And one more, I know we're getting short on time, one more that I'll point out is, we talked about methane before. Other feedbacks in the climate system that we're very concerned with as an earth science community relate to what's happening up in the Arctic right now. So as temperature change as temperatures continue to rise in the Arctic, that is melting or thawing permafrost, which releases a lot of methane into the atmosphere. And how that methane release proceeds over the course of the coming century as it responds to temperature change is a big, there's a lot of uncertainty in that. It's a hot area of research, no pun intended, and something we're paying attention to. So that assumption is built into the model too, so you can play with the slider there. So anyway, those are how we sort of use the model in more advanced classes, really kind of get into the assumptions that are built into this model. But again, the model is an incredible learning tool at any level. And when you get up, drill down into these assumptions, we're really at the cutting edge of science that's going into this. And the model is right on top of the latest results. So it's really nice to see. So I know we're getting short on time, so I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. It is such a rich and interesting model. It's thrilling to know that our students are able to really play with both the high level changes and those underlying assumptions. And I have a feeling everybody's eager to have an opportunity to move those sliders around themselves. So I'm just so grateful to both of you, Peter and Karl, for joining us today, and for everybody. How fun is all this audience participation? I really appreciate it. we're going to send you a link this afternoon so that you can explore En-ROADS on your own. It's transparent, it's freely available. It's going to be absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to play around with it more too. There will also be a link in that email to a very important petition. Congress right now is working through the Build Back Better Act. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to advance the climate solutions like those modeled in En-ROADS. The Build Back Better Act would make the most substantial investment in climate action in our lifetimes. And our congressional representatives need to hear how important it is for them to support it. And as Peter said, we happen to be a small state with very important federal representatives. Our senators and representatives are eager to hear from us, so we'll share the link in that petition later this afternoon. We are also looking ahead to next week. I hope you will all join us. We have a Lunch and Learn legend coming back for another presentation. Dr. Joe Kelly will be with us to share about the Gulf of Maine's dynamic underwater landscape and why the ocean floor is such an interesting place to explore. Dr. Kelly was with us last September and presented the geology of the Maine coast. I don't want to make any of our other presenters, little anxious about this, but I have to tell you, that program on geology of the Maine coast has been viewed more than 1,400 times on YouTube. So there must be something fabulous. Tune in next week to welcome him back and share this recording around when you get the link this afternoon. We'll get Peter and Karl up in that 1,400 views range before too long. Thank you all for joining us. It's a delight to be back in the Lunch and Learn rhythm with you, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Maine Conservation Voters.
Yeah, thank you.